So hello and welcome to Breaking Barriers, the 2022 Open Ed virtual conference hosted by Texas Tech University Libraries. We want this to be a welcoming space. Any form of harassment will not be tolerated and may result in removal from the virtual conference. As a courtesy to our speakers, please keep yourself muted and we encourage you to turn off your video during the presentation. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the library's YouTube channel after the conference is completed. Closed captioning has also been enabled. If you look at your chat, I have sent a link in the chat. This link will take you to the conference homepage where you'll find a brief description of the conference, a presentation schedule for the week, and information about our keynote speaker, which happened yesterday. Please use the chat feature to submit questions at any time. I will be monitoring the questions as they come up and ask them to the presenters during the Q&A portion of the presentation. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, please chat with me directly and make sure to indicate that this is an anonymous question. You're also welcome to turn on your camera and verbally ask questions during the QA portion of this presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for the session, Leslie Sotomayor, presenting Decolonizing the Canon using OER in the Classroom.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me into this space and being a part of this conversation that I think is crucial to as a resource and as a tool within education and curating curriculum and learning environments with our students. Okay, so here we go. I wanted to talk a little bit about the context that I'm coming from. So as a women's and gender studies visiting assistant professor here at TTU, and my background in Latina feminism, Chicana feminism, but also art, and Latino studies and Latin American history, right? Very highly interdisciplinary work. And so because of these things, I think it has afforded me to have a large scope as far as envisioning connections, right, within fields and disciplines and fields of thought and theorizing. And so this has been a great point of accessibility for me then to think about how, as an educator, right, at in higher ed, how I'm coming together to theorize about not only these wonderful theories, right, feminist theories, and how to incorporate it into the classroom, but how we are looking at the materials and sources that we are actually engaging with, right? And what is the responsibility in that conversation? And so the premise that I'm situated in my lens for seeing how these connections occur is through testimonio work and autohistoria teorías. So the theorizing about our own histories, the theorizing about our own lived experiences, the theorizing of what we witness and observe and grapple with from day to day, right? And so Gloria Anzaldúa thinks about these and she wrote extensively about this this idea of our lived experiences and our witnessing of experiences as a resource that each of us have, right? It is a fund of knowledge that each of us houses. And this self-knowledge then is a place that we can theorize from, that we can write from, that we can create from, that we can reframe our realities for self-empowerment and agency as individuals, but also as collective thinkers, right? And so this becomes really important when I'm situating myself as an educator in this capacity within classroom spaces, right? And thinking about how we're each coming in with our own funds of knowledge, right? We're each coming in with our own lived experiences, and we might have some differences and some similarities, but we all have our own positionality within this, right? So how does this play into this conversation with open educational resources and then curating curriculum? And so I want to share with you how I'm using my theorizing of Gloria Anzaldua's Autohistoria, Teoría and Testimonio work as a collaborative tool with OER for curating curriculum, and how I've been doing it. And I would love to hear how others are thinking about this, or any suggestions even throughout what I'm sharing that I'm doing in my classroom spaces with students. So one of the examples that I would like to share with you is, for example, during the fall semester, I taught a winter session called Women of Color Feminisms. And this was a 2-week virtual, pretty intense, heavy course load, right? Because it was mixed with undergrad and grad students. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is accessibility, right? How are my students having access to the materials that I'm curating for class curriculum, right? So do they have to buy a lot of books, right? Are there resources that we as an institution here at TTU can facilitate for them and with them through our learning environments, right? And so this becomes then a really foundational cornerstone in how I'm thinking about the curriculum that I'm using and curating my classes with, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to go about this. And one of the things that was a huge benefit, right, being new faculty here on campus, was to meet with Joshua Salzman, Esther De Leon, Sabrina Davis, right, in the library, and they all have their own expertise within this, right? And with Sabrina really looking at what is OER, how can it help me as a faculty to meet my students where they are, right? And through a lot of the conversations and meetings that we had, I was able to discover that there is just so many possibilities for collaboration with my students in my classroom using OER resources, right? So, so finding how these resources then can connect to the types of classroom environments that I want to create becomes a really big part of this decision-making process, right? And one of the things that I want to that I want all my students to feel in the classroom is that they have access to resources that are valuable, right? That is important scholarship, that is contributing to historical and contemporary relevant social issues, right? Through a feminist lens, through social justice responsiveness, and that they don't have to go into debt and have anxiety and stress financially about how to access the materials that I'm making available through my courses, right? So OER then facilitates this, right? And I'm able to comb through a lot of the portals and virtual platforms, such as Merlot or the open textbooks, to find what it is that I can bring in so that all of my students have access to the same materials without the hindrance or stress or anxiety of a price tag being attached to them, right? Movies and films, talks, TED Talks, YouTube experiences, all of that is also inclusive when I say materials for the classroom space. So for this particular class, one of the things that students had to do was create a blog space or a website, right, where they would document their journey throughout the course through blog entries, right? And so what I did is on Blackboard, I created content folders where each content folder for every day that was on the syllabus schedule, there was a theme. And in that theme, then they also had some prompts to think about for their blog entry, and then the course materials for that day, right? And so that's where I was able to really make use of all of the links that I, had to, of course, prep for and do a lot of research, and comb through the OER sites in order to build then, my pool of materials, right, that I could pick from for this Women of Color Feminism's virtual class. And then after I compiled that, I was able to sort them out into the categories that I wanted to tackle for our curriculum. And so those content folders then became these spaces where students would be able to dive into and then respond and act through their blog entries, right? And so these examples here on the screen are a few examples of what students shared as their blog entries as they're responding to the materials, and most of them were OER based. And so you can see that there is a lot of issues and topics that are being broached through these blog entries that students are engaging with, right? So they're engaging with, world, global, and transnational feminist issues. They're engaging with social issues and politics. They're engaging with art. They're engaging with architecture and history. They're engaging with questions of equality within the United States, and workplace environments. And so this also offers them, especially for a virtual online class setting, to be able to integrate other digitized sources from these sites that they're mining through the OER experience. So this is another two more examples of students engaging through their blogs, through the materials that was curated for the class. And so some of the things that I included in the curriculum for these entries for students to navigate and look through, read, listen, and watch were, for example, Audre Lorde's film that is on the TTU OER portal. It was the Latinx archives, which I'll get to next. Art and activism, the idea of borderlands and feminist theorizing of borderlands, right? So the archives, then, because our digital platforms through TTU are organized in such a way that students are able to then also create really specific divings into different types of archives, right? And looking at archival work. And so one of the other ways that I was able to utilize the open resources digitally with students was to look at the different types of archives that exist. And for this class, the Latinx archives is one of the ones that we went and dove into. And then students were able to guide their own learning through that archive experience. So perhaps I would offer some prompts or questions for initial engagement as they were looking through the archive, but then they were able to go deeper into the archive in any direction that they felt comfortable, to be able to unpack it for themselves and make connections to the other literature that they were also reading and discussing in class. And so these are some examples of diving into the archives and how students interpreted and enacted responses for them. One of my favorite archives through OER is the Equality Archive. It's a fantastic, and you'll see in this image here in particular, on the right-hand side of the Equality Archive website, there's a lot of tag words, right, that you can click on, and then a whole genre, right, that is connected to that will come up, right? And some of them will have films or TED Talks, YouTube clips or interviews, um, right? History, connecting it to other things, right? And then further connections that you can make from that. And so um, this is an example of that I had mentioned earlier with Audre Lorde. So it speaks a little bit about her life, and then there was also connections to her film and other clippings and interviews that were integrated into it as well. And so students then are able to dive into it, and they're also able to dive into any component or aspect of this one archive that they might be interested in seeing or learning more about and integrating into their work. So next, I want to talk about how this is also, we're also talking about feminist activism when we're talking about curating our curriculum in this way where it's accessible to all students, where financial obstacles are not a problem at all, where there's ease of stress and anxiety, right? So we're talking then to also the well-being of our students. And we're also talking to how this embodiment as practice as an educator is a form of activism, right? And what are the ways that can look like? And so one of the things that I think showcases this really well is an event that we collaborated on, we being TTU library faculty and staff, and myself with my women's and gender studies introduction class, one of the sections where we decided to do a wiki editathon focusing on LGBTQIA plus scholarship and research and activism and art that might not be represented accurately on Wikipedia, right? Or might not be holistically represented, where might not have a lot of citations or in-depth knowledge about a given topic or person or groups of people in a way that maybe is going is being marginalized, right, or silenced. And so we launched this event as a fantastic collaborative, which of course we had to do quite a bit of prep for, right? There was someone who, Aaron Burns and Jenny Jacobs and Josh Salzman and Sabrina Davis were all a part of this collaboration. And so I learned a lot from the process of putting together, right? They put together a lip guide for students in these intro classes to be able to think about how the theorizing and the discussions that we were having in class, right, about these feminist lens, using a feminist lens, then how can we apply that to actual doing, right, and activism? And the Wiki Editathon just lends itself really well to thinking about digital archiving and activism through a feminist lens by mining the Wikipedia page and specifically highlighting and looking at what is missing or what might be inaccurate, right? And so this was a really great experience for students to have a hands-on attempt through this digital archival in this particular way. And so this shot here that I'm sharing with you on the screen is the dashboard for our event. And this wasn't just all my class, right? It was a week-long event, but my class of 65 students did contribute to this experience, and we were able to not only, I think Sabrina had come into my class and did a guest speaking talk, about, what is open access, right? What is OER, and how can why is this needed? So it was not only educational about, what are these materials that are creating bases in a lot of different ways, right? Whether it's the canon or the internet, right, on a global scale. But then how can, how does it impact us as individuals, as students, as educators, and how can we impact it, right? And so how can we um, cultivate the knowledge that we are co-creating in a learning environment, and pay it forward in these other way through activist works, right? And so we were able to have these conversations. We had breakout sessions with students where in small groups they were able to not only look through the OER archives and different digital portals that we had kind of bookmarked for them to look through, but then also integrated into the wider scope of Wikipedia and editing. Some other collaborations that I'm intentional about bringing into curriculum building and sharing with my students is, I love working with librarians, faculty, and staff, because not only is there expertise in a lot of different areas, but they're really great at making connections, right? And so, as an educator, that becomes a really useful networking and collaborative relationship for me to have, right? And so, one of the things that I love is creating assignments and workshops in conjunction with library faculty, so that we can bring it into the classroom together, for students to dive into these resources that are available for them, right? And this is how they develop research topics and research interests and writing, conference posters, right? And so one of the um, collaborations that I'm currently in the middle of right now is working with my undergrad feminist thought and theory seminar class, with the Southwest collection, but also bringing in different components of OER resources. And we created an assignment where students are, they've already gone through the research proposal process and formulating now, right, how to dive into the scholarship more deeply for research writing, and creating and designing conference posters, right, to go along with these conversations and actually present in conference platforms, right? And so this layering, this is very intentional, in curating not only the curriculum but also curating our knowledge about these things that we're interested in, right, and want to expand on. And so that's one way that I have found very useful to not only have students become more comfortable using library resources, especially when we're talking about online virtual spaces, right? Sometimes students can feel that they don't have access to these things because they're not on a physical campus to do them. But the digital collections, OER, becomes then a really important tool to integrate into these classroom spaces online. And then providing, we partnered with brainstorming on how we can bring workshops, right? And so virtual and face-to-face options for workshops so that students can receive the one-on-one or small group help that they need, or guidance, support, mentorship, through library resources. And OER is another way that we can foster this. Next, I'd like to talk about feminist scholarship and OER. And although I've shown, right, a lot of different examples of how feminist scholarship is part of the curriculum process, and connecting that to activism and the actual doing part through these spaces, what can that look like in other areas, right? And so currently I'm working with a colleague and friend on OER publishing, right? And so this is through e-Rater, the Rater publishing with Pressbooks. And so it's all virtual, all digitized, all OER, so that everyone will have access to the things that, the knowledge that we are curating, and wanting to publish. And this becomes really important, as a writer, as a creator, an artist, right? How thinking about how am I, um, what can my role in this conversation be, so that I am also part of, creating the most equitable spaces for not only my students, but other educators, right? Other artists, for the network of people that I work with and I want to work with in community building. Then I'm also thinking about, well, is it accessible to all, right? And so this becomes something that I've been thinking more and more about as I've been learning more about OER and using it more in my classrooms. Also thinking that a lot of the community efforts that I'm a part of or want to be more actively a part of, these are also issues that come up in those communities as well. For example, if there is no budget or very little budget within different community sectors, that doesn't allow for, people to go out and buy books, right? To be part of, book discussions, or to theorize about art or art making, right? Or creating curriculum, right? Um, you know, I don't want to write and create work that is not accessible to all, right? And so that's a personal decision that I'm making, right? And um, how can I expand then what I know, to be more inclusive of the communities that I'm a part of, right? So that everyone has access to it. So this book that is in process right now with Dr. Kristen Sperry Garcia, um, and it's entitled Visual Testimonios en Práctico, is an integration of a lot of these, of all of these ideas that I'm talking about, right? Was talking about, it's integrating the autohistoria theorizing, the testimonio theorizing, the creative art making side of it, the scholarship and the research. It's entangling all of those things into one platform, and thinking that we want this to be accessible to all, um, and not have a price wall or border up in that experience. And so that's another consideration that we're taking here as well. And so that kind of sums up an overview of how I am using OER and how I am using, in different capacities. And I would love to, be able to open it up for discussion, or any questions or reflections or comments about anything that I shared here today.
I'll be the first to ask. I love that the Wiki Editathon allowed students to apply what they were learning in class. I'm just curious what their reactions to the event were.
Oh, yeah. So I think a lot of them were very nervous at the idea of thinking that they would somehow be able to edit something that was global, right? Something that that everyone would see, right? And so this was, so I think it was a little intimidating at first. And we were intentional about breaking it down into, steps, so that it didn't feel overwhelming just on one day. and giving examples of what editing looked like or could look like, right? There's different ways to go about editing on Wiki, and some edits, could feel larger than others. So we broke that down, right, and gave really concrete examples of what we had done in the past, right? Those of us that have been a part of the wiki editing in the past. I've been doing it since 2015, I think. So that helped ease that stress and anxiety there. And then the other thing was the feeling afterwards of, wow, I actually contributed something, right, on this massive platform that affects the way other people read and interpret knowledge, right? Because if we think about, a lot of times when we are looking for anything, we're putting into a Google search, and one of the first hits we get is from Wikipedia. So it's a massive platform to be able to engage with. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else or any reflections? It doesn't have to be a question.
I'm also very glad that you're using our press books, Raider Publishing, because man, that is exactly what it's for,
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm very excited about that. And Heidi's been wonderful to work with. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about that as well.
Wonderful.
I'm curious to know if there's anyone here, if there's any suggestions or thoughts on how maybe they've used any of these resources in their teaching or curriculum.
So someone typed into the chat. Someone typed in the chat, I wonder if in the future, if we can create an event to promote faculty OER pubs into Wikipedia entries. And then Hugo said, new to OER.
So I think that the first comment that you read would be really fantastic as a workshop or a roundtable to be able to do that, right? And what a way to highlight scholarship, right? Just with something as simple as including it in references and citations on Wikipedia. So that's a great idea. I've seen that done at conferences in the past. And for Hugo, who's new to OER, I hope then that you're able to see how inspiring it can be, for use.
So do you have any advice for colleagues who are new to or unsure about OER?
Yeah, so I'm curious to know why they're unsure, but um, but I think that for me, when I heard the title, the name OER, I had no idea what it meant. I was not aware of it, and so having someone take the time to kind of go through it with me live on the site was really helpful, because I didn't even know where to start to navigate, right? And there is so much on there. And so having that one-on-one guidance was a huge help for me, right? And it was a huge help for me to also start thinking about, okay, how can I use this, right? So one of the other things that that I'm also in the process of discussing now is, as we're looking, my faculty team that I'm a part of in my program, as we're looking at curriculum in our courses, that needs to be revised or updated, right? We can be really intentional about thinking, how can that happen so that it's accessible to all of our students, right? How can we maximize that accessibility, right? I think one of the biggest complaints that I hear often from students is the amount of money that they have to spend on books, right? I remember when I was a student, that was a pretty significant obstacle every semester, right? And if you're an art student like I was, right, I'm also spending money on art supplies. And there's all these other things, right, that we need to budget in our everyday life. And so, this is one way to offset those stresses and pressures so that students can navigate their education with one less thing against them, right? And so having that one-on-one um, navigating help on the OER and seeing not only everything that's available, and it wasn't even everything that was available. It was strategically looking at what was relevant to what, you know, was in my field and my disciplinary that I wanted to integrate, right? And then I could, mining those resources really carefully to see what would make sense for the curriculum that I'm working on. And so, that's an ongoing process and it changes, which is the wonderful thing is that it's fluid and can be very right. We can connect it to a lot of contemporary things that are relevant in our classrooms, especially for someone who's working not only with historical social issues but contemporary social issues. That becomes really important. It's a great question.
See, someone's raised their hands. Katie.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, if it's okay, I'll just jump in. And it's along that I was kind of embarrassed to admit that I had not been using access to this. I spend a lot of time scouring online for TED Talks, availability to films that we used to have access to through Canopy, through our department. And so looking for TED Talks, readings, because I feel exactly the same way, but I really love how you put it. Creating equal access to data is feminist activism. It's very feminist pedagogy. And that struck me because it is something I try so hard to do. There's a beautiful documentary, Half the Sky, that I had to stop using because it was taken off of Netflix. So that trying to work around what I can find free and accessible online. And here this is right in front of me. So I'm a little embarrassed, but I'm glad I attended because that's the place to start. I can
Absolutely.
So I'm so excited. Dr.
Well,
Sotomayor,
and that's,
thank you.
I think you also bringing up another really great and important point is that as as um, as instructors and educators in these spaces, we do spend so much time. I was spending so much time, like what you're saying, Katie, right? Like, mining and asking colleagues, right? Like what, and trying to brainstorm together to piece all of these different pieces together for curriculum building. So when this came to my attention that there's even whole like lesson plans and curriculums that are accessible through OER for educators. That just blew my mind because I'm like, we have access to all this and like, how did I not, like, how is this not something that was, here's your new job and you have OER, right? Like,
Right?
So I sorry. But yeah, it's totally accurate in what you're describing, and that was my expression as well.
Well, thank you again so much. And I haven't been to a talk in a bit where I'm like this excited to go check something out and to reach out and speak to Sabrina. I saw that you posted your information. So thank you very much for addressing that.
We have another question in the chat from Joshua. Feminist pedagogy and OER, do you see a connection between the OER publishing practices and activism for marginalized and minority content? Does it offer opportunities or visibility that traditional publishing either doesn't offer or restricts in a way that benefits privileged academic groups?
Okay, this is a great question. Sorry, okay. So I think that one of the things that, people might be thinking is, does it have the same level of prestige, right? Press books and OER with publishing versus some other traditional ways of publishing. And that was something that my colleague and I, for example, had talked about in making the decision whether we wanted to go this route. And we had asked around to different people, and what I realized is that a lot of people either aren't understanding or knowing exactly what OER is or can be. And so I don't think that that mainstream knowledge about it is there yet. So there's awareness that needs to happen. And then I think the other part of it is that sorry, I just totally lost my train of thinking for a second. Is that the reason, it reminded me of the reason why I do the work I do, right? The reason I do the work I do is to serve underrepresented communities that don't have the opportunities that I think they should have, right? And don't have access to the opportunities that they should have. And so the publishing realm then opens up a whole pocket of conversation about this in a very nuanced way. And so I can't speak to the content yet, but that's a great question, and one that I think I will dive into to do some research about, Josh, because I think that's a really important question that I hadn't really thought about much in this capacity. But I do think that it offers opportunities for more visibility within the communities and that I'm working in. So, for example, when I'm working within artist communities and curator communities and communities that are marginalized in a variety of different ways, I think that this publication will speak to those communities directly in ways that so I just published my first book, right, in a traditional realm, in a way that book will not have access to. So I do think it is different, right? There's more creativity, there's more possibilities for creative collaborations. So a lot of the work that is going to be a part of this book opportunity that I'm sharing here is, for example, using color, right? And using text in a creative way that is not traditional in academia, using text as moving images, right? Through creative practice and animation and, graphic design that we wouldn't be able to do in a print book, right? And so one of the wonderful things about this experience is that this idea that we actually have had for a couple of years now to publish a book in this realm, we had been dreaming about it, but we didn't know if we could actually do it because we hadn't met anyone that, a publisher that could make it happen. So it wasn't until we met OER, right, and this whole conversation unraveled, and then working with Raider Publishing Press Books with Heidi, we, just dreamt out loud, and they were like, yeah, you can do that. And we were just blown away by it, right? So it offers a whole other way of thinking how to publish book and how to create book content that we've never seen, right? Created. Oh, awesome. So Heidi's going to be presenting. Yeah. So yeah, so we're really excited about being able to create, a book that's going to talk to creativity and scholarship and writing and research in a way, in a very nuanced way, that you could not get from a traditional text, and be able to share that with all our students and colleagues, right? And collaborators. Like, that's amazing.
Any other questions? Okay, if there's no other questions, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting talk.
Thank you so much, Joy. I appreciate it. Thank you everyone for attending and joining the conversation. It was great.
Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for the session, Venki Uddameri, presenting Using Open Education Resources for Promoting Global Sustainability. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. So just to give you a brief background, I'm a professor in civil environmental and construction engineering. So I'm approaching OER from an engineering perspective, largely an engineering perspective. And I'm going to talk about a few of my experiences with OER, what I have done in the past, and some of the projects that I have worked on where OER kind of became a necessity and also offered a lot of advantages to what I was planning to do in that. So my work mostly is related to water resources engineering. I'm also the director of the Texas Tech University Water Resources Center. So I work on water issues, groundwater issues all over the world. I've had projects in Ethiopia, in India, in China, Oman, Brazil. Many places where water is just as scarce as it is in the high plains of Texas, but also there are the similar issues of how do we protect this water, conserve this water, especially in light of climate change, growing water stresses and such. So that's where a lot of my research is, and a lot of my teaching is related to those aspects as well. So one thing as we see globally is that a significant portion of our higher secondary or college age students is significantly much more in developing nations, particularly in Africa and Asia. And this also means that the future engineering workforce or the future workforce will predominantly be dominated by people coming out of these countries. And if you start looking at education backgrounds in them, there are a lot of great engineering schools out there, but access to modern education continues to lag in most of these nations. Even in some of the very best schools, say in India or China, you will still see a lot of outdated modes of teaching, outdated modes of methods that don't quite exploit the recent innovations that have been happening in this space. So this is particularly true in engineering as well as in other STEM disciplines as well. So the question is, if you are going to get most of our workforce in the future, engineering workforce in the future from these countries, and they're not getting the type of engineering education that we think they should have, then clearly that's an untenable path or an unsustainable path that needs to be fixed. So even in today's world, much of global engineering workforce comes from India and China. There's a growing number of new engineers coming from African countries and other emerging economies. And there was a recent survey done by a business organization in India that basically said, India is, by the way, the largest producers of engineers in the world at this point in time. And they basically said that 80% of Indian engineers are not fit for jobs just because they don't have modern skills. Their fundamentals are fine, but they just don't have cutting edge technologies, or they're not familiar with cutting edge technologies that industry needs. So, and basically it also went on to say that only 2.5% of graduating engineers possess tech skills in emerging areas such as artificial intelligence that industry is increasingly requiring them to have. So there are other challenges as well. A lot of these areas tend to be areas that are fast growing, which also means that there is a greater push on their resources, natural resources, and how they manage their resources becomes important in light of their sustainability in the future, as well as the global sustainability in general. So that is another part where you will start seeing that areas like in Africa, India, China are really not doing as well on sustainability indicators as say US, Canada and others, where the population growth is not as dramatic as they are in these countries. So even for their own sustainability, it's important that these engineers think about ways in which they can exploit technologies or harness technologies that are out there to develop, to manage their resources well, particularly their water resources, their environment and such that are of interest to me, because that eventually has effects on economic development and social development. So when it comes to engineering education, there are a few specific challenges. One is access to modern textbooks. So clearly cost there is a major factor. And many US textbooks, particularly in the US, but most Western textbooks, rely on commercial software tools for their design and analysis. So it's just not enough that you have a textbook, but there is an associated software that's that you need a license for as well. So these textbooks are not as easily translatable to a broader community of practice, partly because you just, it's not enough that you get them the textbook, you have to get them the software, the licenses and such. And most of these software programs have moved to what's known as the annual licensing models, where they essentially say, you don't have to worry about buying a new software every year, you just pay into our license, we'll update, keep on updating this software. That has some advantages, but that tends to be pretty expensive. So it's not like you can buy once and use that for a few years. You have to continually keep renewing this academic discount. So when I did my work in Ethiopia, India, and other places, what I saw was there was a rampant use of pirated versions, and some of these may or may not work. And there were safety issues associated with using them because there were viruses built into it and whatnot that was problematic. And most importantly, for graduate students, when they use this type of software, they just simply couldn't publish it because they didn't have a valid license to go with it. So that was a big issue for them, stopping them from using some of the modern tools, especially the tools that are traditionally used in engineering practice, say in the US or in the West. And also the data collected by agencies in these areas tend to protect them much more than make it open even for educational institutions. So that is another concern that came in when I was working in Ethiopia in particular. So while there are many challenges associated with this, one thing that has been very positive has been the penetration of internet. So if you look at different continents between 2000 to 2022, the internet penetration in Africa went up by 13,220%. And in Asia, that was about 2005, close to 2,500%. So you can see that the fastest growing areas in terms of internet penetration is Africa and Asia. And I've been to many places in Africa and Asia, and what you see is that you will have internet on your cell phone, You may not have power most of the times, but your internet tends to be fairly reliable. So that's certainly something that needs to be exploited if we were to think about providing access to educational resources in these countries. So my hypothesis was that open educational resources provide an excellent mechanism to improve engineering education globally. And I tend to view open educational resources as not just open source books or study materials, but also look at open source data sets as well as free and open source software. So to me, I look at open education resources to comprise of data that is free to use, free to analyze, software that's free to use and analyze, as well as educational resources that can exploit these two data and software to develop engineering solutions or engineering analysis that we need to do. So the idea is that if we integrate open educational resources, with open data or open source data and free and open source software, you can create very unique pedagogic opportunities that are simply not possible with the traditional textbook publishing milieu that exists right now. So particularly if you look at OER in engineering, traditional textbook publishing is difficult, partly because it's a relatively smaller market. So you have one or two textbooks in there, and people simply will say, I don't want another textbook in that domain, partly because there's not enough of a market. The downside is these books do get outdated somewhat quickly, especially in a few areas. Even if the material is not outdated, the way we use this material gets outdated very quickly. For example, 30 years ago, a lot of what we did as hand calculations about 20 years or so ago, we started doing them using spreadsheets. And then now the trend is to use Python or R or some of these softwares, other types of software to do this similar analysis. So we might be doing the same analysis that we did 30 years ago, but the way we are doing this analysis has changed, partly because the speed allows us to do or analyze a lot more scenarios and look at certain things that were not possible just because we were doing hand calculations or doing it the harder way, if you may. So the downside of all this is, of course, the costs become high. It's somewhat of a monopoly in the market, so there is not enough competition. So people will say, well, I can raise this price. There'll still be a market for it. So that's one issue. And second issue, as faculty, we always struggle in saying, should students be buying these books? Because do they serve as reference books? In some ways they do, because the fundamentals are not changing as much, but the way they are doing things are different. So how useful it is for them to have this book and buy this book and keep it on their shelf for future engineering practice. So that's a constant battle that a lot of engineering faculty face, partly trying to balance the need for a textbook in the short run versus it serving as a reference book in the long run as students graduate and start practicing engineering. One thing that has also happened is the modern generation students grew up in a very different environment than we did, which also means that they had greater access to the internet, they had greater access to YouTube and audiovisual stimuli more so than we did. So what we see is that students tend to prefer to like audiovisual media. They like videos. They like things presented as blogs as opposed to a classic black and white text with 10-point font. even if it's published on a glossy paper with a few colored images here and there, that is not something that's appealing to them. And this is, I point here that over 50% of students in an economics class were actually visual learners, and a significant, over 90% of them preferred audio-visual over any other form of learning. So this is another big change that we are seeing. That also means that the traditional textbook markets have limited avenues when it comes to adding this interactivity or engaging student engagement with these books becomes increasingly difficult just because of their learning styles and just because of the way they are processing information. So this is where I see a lot of excitement when it comes to OER, because OER makes it extremely easy to embed different types of materials into a single forum or into a single platform. That makes things, very easy to engage with students, interact with students, turn their individual learning also into somewhat of an interactive learning mechanism. So especially, we can integrate written matters, audio visuals, animations. So this kind of makes it really exciting, regardless of the discipline you are in. I think this one particular piece generally applies across different fields. And I think the previous speaker was also talking about this. So this certainly is a big plus for engineering, and especially for someone like me who does a lot of computational work. Connecting simulation platforms and moving between an OER and a simulation platform is become very easy these days. Things like GitHub and Google Colab allow us to run programs on the cloud, on the web, and so the student is reading a book on the web, looks at a needs to write a piece of code to do some tasks. Rather than reading that code, they can actually go to that spot, run that piece of code, see what it does, and engage with that book much more so than they would otherwise. So that is something that has been very useful, particularly those using simulations or those who are writing code or writing programs as part of their teaching. There is a lot of cool ways in which we can connect those two activities. Rather than treat them as two separate activities, we can connect them together and create an interactive experience for students. There are also cloud-based data storage platforms that help us enhance or extend our laboratory experiences. So this is another place where I think OER can play a very big role. Particularly, I've used it in a couple of different ways to extend a laboratory class that I teach, and how we could add some other things to that lab, because the timing and the amount of time that's allotted for that lab is insufficient to do a lot of experiments, and also the setup of the lab itself doesn't allow us to do a lot of different types of experiments. So we can extend some of these lab works virtually using IoT or IoT type platforms, along with interactive dashboards that allow students to understand the concepts or go beyond what is happening in the lab to see what's happening, to get a further understanding or a deeper understanding of the material that's being presented. So as I said, when we talk about open source OER, for me, OER and open source software are very strongly linked, because I use quite a bit of programming and scripting and analysis as part of my education, as part of my teaching, as well as part of my research. So having open source software programs is really an important piece of my pedagogy. So initially, 20 years ago when I started teaching, I was mostly focused on using commercial software because that's the only thing that was available. But over time, there is a lot of good software that has come out. I list a few here, particularly Python, R, QGIS in the Geographic Information Systems or Spatial Analysis environment. There are some really good databases to store very large volumes of data, analyze this data, and then Julia is an up-and-coming programming language that's open source from MIT. That allows you to do some advanced computational work relatively easily. So, these software are just as good, or sometimes even better than commercial software that we find in the market, expensive commercial software such as ArcGIS or MATLAB that we historically have used in engineering. And certainly they can be replaced with open source software, making it all the more easier for people to use this work and disseminate this work, and also allow for growth of these softwares, which will support OER. Similarly, we have also seen a lot of global data becoming accessible, or at least having data sets at a global scale being available. A lot of this has been driven by studies on climate change and global change. US has the globalchange.gov. They have a global change research program where they assimilate data from worldwide using remote sensing technologies, the RS and the global positioning systems. The availability of GPS in particular on cell phones has made it very easy to geolocate data, like geocode data, and that has added a new dimension to our analysis that was otherwise not possible, not say even 10 years ago. So similarly, we are able to find elevation data on the Earth. There's a lot of different types of data sets, and this is not only useful to disseminate, education outside of the U.S. But it's also very useful, at least I found it very useful to do things here and provide a global perspective, particularly, for example, in the hydrology class that I teach, I've delineated transboundary watersheds, watersheds that on Rio Grande River that go both within the U.S. and into Mexico, and then we are able to see what are the changes between the watershed on the U.S. side versus the Mexican side, and what does that mean? Those things can help quite a bit in terms of trying to talk about the socio-technical aspects of engineering, which is very important but very hard to teach, partly because they tend to be a lot of abstract, they tend to be in abstract for a lot of students, but being able to delineate some of these watersheds, say in Africa or along the U.S.-Mexico border, and talk about why people fight about water. Why is water an agent of change? Why is water important for sustainability? What type of cooperation is needed between nations when we talk about water resources or other environmental resources or natural resources? Comes to life when you are able to do a problem in that area, as opposed to just talking about it in abstraction. So that's another big plus in terms of globalizing the education within the US, as well as getting students excited about some of the global problems related to water that one would otherwise not see or easy to talk about in a strictly US-based context. So there are many avenues for implementing OER or OER type work, or so OER supported work. Clearly, great support from TTU libraries, both Sabrina Davis and Katie and Heidi Winkler, both are wonderful, wonderful resources. Please make use of them as much as you can. They are always there to help, and I've found that very useful. Several other resources. OpenStax has quite a few books. They tend to be, at least on the engineering side, very focused on fundamentals. So I typically tell students, if you need to look something up in calculus or, elementary probability, something that you've learned in the undergraduate level and quite don't have a textbook to follow, these books provide good avenues to get that material. So that's where I've used OpenStax. Michelle Singh yesterday talked about the Digitex and some of the research resources that they have in terms of making transitions to OER. So one other place where I have tried to push OER type is the ResearchGate, which many engineers use to document their research, but it can also be a good place to disseminate OER type, research-based OER or graduate level OER, and make it available to a much wider audience. The last class I'm going to talk about is you can create cloud-based dissemination platforms these days that have become very cheap, roughly about $10 or less than 2 lattes from Starbucks. Can get you your own cloud computing platform to do certain things, put up web resources, computational resources, and such. So there are many things that we can do. So what I'll do is give a few examples of how I have used OER in the past, and then open it up for discussion and open it up for additional thoughts and comments. So I've been teaching for over 20 years now, and one of the things is I've never liked using a textbook. The big reason for that is there are some chapters in some textbooks that are very good, other chapters in other textbooks that are really good. But what happens in engineering education is we tend to have a lot of formulas and we tend to have a lot of equations. And ironically, the competing books tend to use very different notations. So we can't just simply mix and match these things as much as we like. So I've always liked to give my own notes. I've been using LaTeX to kind of typeset those notes, particularly because the mathematics has to be correct. Otherwise, it causes a lot of confusion for students. So this is another place where OER can really, really be helpful, partly because you have complete control. So if there is a mistake or if there is a typo in your work, particularly a mathematical one, you can go and fix it instantaneously rather than have it to wait for the second edition or put out an errata that people may or may not see. So that's another big advantage of OER. So one place where I've used OER is to disseminate complex workflows. There is a data format known as NetCDF. NetCDF is a file structure that's almost like a desk drawer. So you can think of there are multiple drawers in a box, and so your X and Y axis are your spatial axis, and the drawer is your time. So you've got things stacked up in time. So it's a three-dimensional data set that has its own format. Not many programs can read these files, but NetCDF files are extremely useful to provide large volumes of data, that is otherwise not easy to disseminate. So when it comes to like very large scale global climate simulations, model simulations, and things like that, those types of data tend to be given in NetCDF because you're doing it across the world. So you have the X and Y dimensions of the world, and then you're doing it in time, say for 100 years, 1,000 years. So you've got a lot of data that has to be processed. And so NetCDF is one such file format. While NetCDF was very popular, the problem is there were very few programs that could open it or had some resources, but it was just very difficult. It was scattered all over the place. So because we were using NetCDF quite a bit in our research, I had created a workflow on how to do this. I had taken a NetCDF file and walked through my students through those steps of how to get data out of it and look at it. So I, simply just to disseminate it, put it out on ResearchGate, and there are about 22,000 plus downloads in the last 2-3 years of this, over the last 4 or 5 years of this. And on top of it, there have been many who have really recommended using this. So this is perhaps one of my most downloaded articles. And it was not just a PDF file explaining the process, but I also provided them with an R script to do the analysis. And then I produced a real world data set, and so that they were able to reproduce this research. So just as reproduce the analysis. So just as we have reproducible research, when we talk about reproducibility in the research, we can also talk about reproducible pedagogic practices. So a student should be able to take an analysis or a design and be able to do those steps on their own using the information that's provided. So that is one way. This is one example where, again, most engineers and others have workflows written like this. It's just a question of putting them up and making it accessible to a larger group. And a big number of downloads, a big chunk of these downloads actually come from Africa and Asia, where people are trying to delineate watersheds, delineate other things, and they simply don't know how, they don't have the resources to access them or access commercial software. So there's an entirely open source software, open source data set with some open source pedagogy can create some very useful avenues for dissemination of information that's useful for students. I did a project a few years ago in Ethiopia. One of the things that was happening in Ethiopia was that students Ethiopia would give money, the government of Ethiopia would give money to students to go and study abroad, particularly in the US. The students would come, they would do some research and realize that that research was really not transferable back to Ethiopia. So they found jobs and stayed in this country. So the Ethiopian government decided that's not the right model. What we want to do is we want to bring US researchers to come to Ethiopia and build PhD programs there and help build PhD programs. So they wanted to do that. We got this project funded. And so we helped build a PhD program in civil engineering at Jimma Institute of Technology in Ethiopia, and then several other schools. They were part of a large clusters of schools where eventually these programs would be built, master's programs would be built. So as part of that, I had a few students, and they were working on water issues. Drought, of course, is a very big concept in Ethiopia because 98% of Ethiopian agriculture is dryland agriculture. So the only place where they do irrigation is coffee. All their food crops are grown under dryland irrigation. Of course, given its location, is very drought prone. So there is, drought plays a very big role in the society of Ethiopia as a whole. So I told one of the students, let's look at droughts. And the student wanted to collect data. He said, so we said the data is with the ministry. So we got some letters written, all that stuff. The education ministry wrote the water ministry, and the water ministry said, yes, you can have access to data. Student went to get the data. And the guy there, then the student came back to me and said, is it possible for your project to pay bribes to this person, because that's how I'm going to get access to this data, regardless of what letters you have? And I was like, no, I can't do that. And obviously I'll have to, I'll end up in jail if I were to do this. So we started looking at global data sets. We started looking at, and also all of them were using this pirated software. So they're like, well, I can do this analysis, but I can't publish. I'm like, have you looked at open source software? And so I had to teach them a lot of open source software, show them open source data sets, put them all together, and then say, hey, here are alternative tools that you can use to do legitimate analysis. You don't have to depend on pirated software, which may or may not work, or who knows what it is. And so it ended up getting published, getting cited. So now I see a lot of papers coming out of Ethiopia where people are using open source software and open source data sets. So the floodgates have been opened, to study droughts, ironically. But so it's really, I think, just providing that access, providing that information can spark new lines of inquiry and new lines of pedagogy, as well as new lines of research in many areas that is strictly possible if we can exploit open education resources. One of the things that I have done is set up a cloud server. And on the cloud server, I create like a lot of interactive dashboards using Python and R Shiny and Flex dashboard type frameworks. And this is used to extend the labs. So we do a lab on density. So students can click here, see a video of how that lab is being done. Then they go and get a little bit of information on what does density depend on. They can interact to see how the density changes with temperature, how the density changes with salinity and temperature. So I talk about role of brackish groundwater, some of the socio-technical aspects associated with it. But it helps me extend my lab further into a realm where we are able to look at how does density change with temperature. We only make one temperature measurement in the lab. But here we are able to expand that over a range of temperatures. Similarly, we do measurements at one salinity. We expand that to look at a range of salinities and temperatures and help students understand how to analyze two-dimensional data, contour plots, and then talk about some additional material that we otherwise couldn't cover within the parameters of the lab. So again, an open source, setting up the server costs about $10 a month. It is a little bit of a steep learning curve to set this up, but once you do, there are a lot of benefits in terms of disseminating this information and keeping students engaged with materials in the lab. Outside the lab work as well, outside the classroom as well. Third example is an OER textbook that I'm writing through the Pressbook platform, the Raider Press at TTU. Clearly, the things that were very interesting to me were I teach several levels of classes. I teach several graduate level classes, but also undergraduate level classes. And what I teach at the graduate level builds on undergraduate levels. And as I said, the software that we use has changed over the years. So we have a lot of grad students who have not used Python or R, which I use extensively in my graduate level classes. And we are moving towards teaching Python at the undergraduate level. So I was interested in putting a textbook together to kind of cover the spectrum of entry points, if you may, where students will come in and use portions of the textbook. Of course, they don't want to buy one big textbook for it, or buy several books along the way. So I found OER platform to be an excellent place. Interestingly, I think Sabrina had sent an email about OER. I said, hey, let me see what's going on. And then I talked to her and she put me in touch with Heidi, and, who gave me a little crash course on how to set up and, put this book to, start putting the book together. And really, it's been a great experience, trying to get this book put together. One of the advantages is, I'm able to add audio visuals now to this book. So I can store this on Google Drive and then connect it to get audio visuals in the book. So I had a lot of videos that I used to scaffold the education. So that has been, so I can link those videos with this material. Similarly, I can link software code snippets on the cloud with this book, so that student is reading the book, they click and they go to the software, and then it opens up a new tab, they work on that software, and then they come back to the book, and so they can interact with this book at multiple points of entry that a traditional textbook, it's very hard to do in a traditional textbook. And of course, as software changes, I can go make changes on the fly without having to worry about the second edition to come out, or think about those things, which also tend to be a little difficult in engineering, given the small market. So as I said, it shows you here, I'm showing you several screenshots. For example, I have a Python example here. Of course, they can click on this link here, very bottom, and then it opens another tab where they can see this code, and then they can actually run individual pieces of this code to see what's going on as things move. We can make use of pedagogic objects like learning objectives, putting things, highlighting things. And even the setup of the book comes out really well, because Pressbooks uses WordPress, so showing content, looking at things. So you can get a very professionally designed book with very minimal effort. So certainly, I'm a big fan of this platform, and plan to use this for my other classes as well. So just a quick summary. Textbook cost, we all know, is not just an issue in the US, but worldwide, particularly in an area where there are a lot of engineering students. So that's a big issue. Internet penetration has been very fast compared to other development, for example, electrification. So people have access to internet, and people have figured out ways to connect their computers. So they use batteries, they use other things, especially in Africa and other places where electricity is not reliable, but they have found ways to keep their internet reliable. OER provides an excellent pathway to reach this audience, develop global case studies, and that's just not useful for them, but really the benefits are also in the US, where we can infuse socio-technical reflections. We can talk about the purpose of engineering, the purpose of water, purpose of conservation of natural resources, sustainability, using examples where there are critical, with systems that are critically being stressed, so they understand what role does engineering play in the society as a whole, which is again a very important thing. Smaller markets, dynamic changes would also mean OER and engineering is a very good fit. If you integrate FOSS and OSD, the free and open source software, as well as open source data sets with OER, it becomes even more powerful. And some of these open source software have become industry standard in recent times, partly because they're being supported by Google, Facebook, and others have been developing libraries to support some of the advanced analysis that are available for free. They are better than commercial software because there are thousands of people working on it worldwide to make things better. So there are many models for OER integration. I showed you about 3 different models that I've used. Pressbooks, Radar Digital Publishing is really an excellent platform. Even if you want to write short course notes and things like that, I think it offers you a lot of really good tools with very minimal learning curve. And the other parts are to look at some of the public open-facing platforms like ResearchGate or others like OSF. There are a few other, ARXIV, there are a few other places where you can put this type of information for larger public dissemination. And of course, you can also create your own web servers and disseminate information that way, which would be the most complicated route. So thank you all for your time, and thank you for listening. I'll be happy to open up and take any questions.
We have one question in the chat. What would you say to engineering colleagues who are unsure about or new to OER, open source software, and open data sets?
This is something I would say they should give it a try. And, even if they want to try it small and see, trying to do a module and see how it works out and the benefits that accrue because of that uh, is, I think they'll be pleasantly surprised. So, um, even a small module, even a lecture note, even something that they have already in place, they can package it with some amount of time. Uh, that would be a really useful benefit. I know because of COVID, a lot of us did our lectures, when we went online, we have online lectures and we have other things. Rather than just tossing them away, OER can be a great platform to link that as a supplement to face-to-face education. So there are many ways in which you can mix and match what you have to create OER. For me, it's like, for me, education is like the more you give, nobody can take it away from me. That's the best part. And I only gain by sharing and not losing. So I don't lose anything by sharing. So there are certain things where, specific engineering practices and designs, there are patents and things like that where people do worry about it. And I think that, but there is a lot of education related work that is open, that needs to be open, just because, it's not patentable, and certainly open to OER. I think it's right for OER dissemination.
I have a question. You have a wide variety of open educational resources that you've worked on. Do you have any advice for faculty looking to represent their OER work on their tenure and promotion documents?
Yeah, I would say, particularly in engineering, we write a lot of software, we write a lot of code to publish a paper, right? So you publish the paper, but you have all these extra material that is, there is greater push now to make it open, but there have not been ways to do that. What I've always done is, before I embark on a research, I try to do a very simple problem that I can teach in my class. And that is very OERable, in my opinion, and that provides a good context for people to see what the big picture is. The rest is all. So I try to strip away as much details as possible, try to put a very simple model, try to understand, just to explain the big picture of what I'm trying to do. And then, of course, for the real analysis, there is going to be a lot of details added in. So I've tried to take that and present it at ASW conferences or other places. And I think those can be very good OER, because especially as you try to communicate your research, saying that, hey, this is what we do, you're able to help people understand things at a conceptual level without having to delve into the mathematics of it or the details of it and then bring it back.
Okay, we have another question on the chat. Many people question the quality of OER. What would you say to a colleague who questions the quality of a resource that you're using?
Well, as I said, this is an ongoing challenge. Certainly OER, just because we look at online publishing, there are some great journals there. And there are also a lot of predatory journals. People really don't know where to place OER per se. The best thing is, to do your own evaluation and see how does OER help you, and not start with a bias saying that this is all bad, right? So, and that's, I think, the biggest barrier. And also, I think there are two big barriers. One is the quality usually is, to me, secondary to the amount of work that's needed to look at OER. Like, they tend to think that, oh, there is so much information out there, 98% of which is probably not good. Do I want to search that large space to get that 2%? And that, that time constraint seems to be a big challenge when people want to adopt OER. So once they adopt it, they understand that, if the quality is bad, they will never adopt it in the first place. And if they don't feel the benefit, they will not adopt it in the first place. So I think a big challenge for them is this is working. It has worked in the past. It's not the best. I can supplement it with certain things, and let's keep moving. Like, so how do you break that status quo? Is quality really something to help you keep that status quo, maintain that status quo, or is it something that can truly help? Are some of the issues. And I think having a librarian who can help with doing some of that research for you would be very beneficial. And so I think I would strongly suggest to them to work with Sabrina and others to narrow down what we are to look at, what parameters to look at, and try to find peer-reviewed, vetted resources and things like that. So a lot of that goes back again, I think, to the education and people. OER becoming more of a mainstream, which I see it happening in years to come, but that's certainly a process.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Someone posted, we have a long way to go, but we'll get there.
That's right. That is, every step in this direction is a good step. So,
any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for the presentation. It's really interesting.
Thank
I
you.
was actually really glad to see the open source software on there.
Yes, I'm a big fan of open source everything. So, thank you all for the opportunity. Thanks.